January 9th, 1980. An ordinary evening in Austin, Texas. The sun sets. Night falls. People go about their lives. Families gather for dinner. Friends make plans. The city breathes with the rhythm of a normal American evening. But on one quiet street in Austin, something terrible is about to happen. A young woman steps out of her house. She's walking to a friend's place, just 1 block away. A short journey on a peaceful evening. She has no idea that this walk will be her last. I'm Yoon-Jin Lee, and this is the story of Susan Leigh Wolfe, a nursing student whose life was stolen in a moment of violence. This is the story of how her killer evaded justice for 44 years. This is the story of how modern science finally revealed what seemed impossibly hidden. Susan was 25 years old. She had just enrolled as a nursing student at the University of Texas at Austin. She had dreams. She had a future. She had a whole life ahead of her. But all of that ended on that January evening in 1980. For 44 years, her family waited for answers. For 44 years, the Austin Police Department investigated without finding the killer. For 44 years, Susan's case remained an unsolved mystery that haunted investigators, tormented her family, and challenged the justice system. But in 2024, everything changed. Autopsy evidence from 1980 was re-examined using cutting-edge DNA technology. What had been hidden for nearly half a century suddenly became visible. The truth, preserved in biological samples from 1980, finally spoke through the language of modern science. This is a story about the power of technology to solve what seemed unsolvable. This is a story about how justice, even delayed by 4 decades, is still justice. This is the true crime story of how horror finally found resolution. Do you believe that no crime is ever truly cold? Do you believe that justice can come, even after 44 years? Could autopsy evidence from decades ago hold the key to your family's healing? If you want to discover how modern DNA analysis is revolutionizing cold case investigations, if you want to explore the stories of victims whose names almost faded into history, please subscribe and turn on your notifications. We tell the stories that seemed destined to remain unsolved. We remember the victims that society almost forgot. We investigate the mysteries that prove that time cannot erase the truth. Let's find the truth together. Austin in 1980 was a vibrant city, but like any city, it had its dark side. The capital of Texas, Austin was known for its music scene, its university, its culture. The University of Texas at Austin was one of the most prestigious universities in America. Thousands of young people came to the city every year to study, to build their futures, to make their dreams real. January was a winter month in Texas, but Austin's winters were mild compared to other parts of the country. The evenings were cool, but not cold. The air was fresh. The night was young. On January 9th, 1980, a Wednesday evening, the city was alive with the ordinary rhythms of life. People worked, students studied, families gathered. Nothing suggested that something terrible was about to happen. Susan Leigh Wolfe lived with roommates in a residential neighborhood of Austin. She had just started her nursing studies at the University of Texas. She was building a life, creating a future, pursuing her dreams. That evening, her house had been sprayed for bugs, a routine pest control treatment. The smell inside was strong, so Susan decided to get out of the house for a bit. She would walk to a friend's place, just 1 block away. A simple, ordinary plan. Something millions of people do every day without thinking about danger. The neighborhood was residential, relatively safe by the standards of the time. It was the kind of place where people didn't necessarily lock their doors, where people assumed that a short walk in the evening was something you could do without fear, where the idea of random violence seemed distant and unlikely. Susan left her house around 10 p.m. The night was dark. The street was quiet. She was walking just 1 block to her friend's house. This was a journey she could have made blindfolded. This was a journey millions of people make every single day. But on this night, evil was waiting on this street. Evil in the form of a predator. Evil in the form of a man with violent intentions. evil in the form of someone who had decided that this evening would be an opportunity. Susan Leigh Wolfe had no idea what was about to happen. She was just walking to a friend's house. She had no reason to be afraid. She had no sense of the danger that was waiting. But danger was there. And in moments, her entire life would change forever. Susan Leigh Wolfe was 25 years old. She was a nursing student at the University of Texas at Austin, one of the most prestigious nursing programs in the country. She had been accepted to the program. She had enrolled. She was beginning her studies to become a nurse, a profession dedicated to caring for others, to helping the sick and injured, to making a difference in people's lives. Her choice of profession suggested something about her character. Nursing is a calling. It requires compassion, dedication, the willingness to work hard and to put others' needs before your own. Susan had chosen this path. She was committed to becoming a healer. She was young. She was educated. She was building a life in a major city, pursuing a meaningful career. She had family who cared about her. She had friends. She had roommates who knew her. She had a future that stretched ahead with possibility. She was the kind of young woman who represented hope. She represented the potential of youth. She represented the belief that hard work and dedication could create a meaningful life. But on January 9th, 1980, all of that potential was erased in moments of violence and brutality. Susan lived with roommates in Austin. That evening, after the pest control treatment, she decided to visit a friend. It was a casual plan, a short walk, something she had probably done many times before without incident. Around 10 p.m., she left her house. 1 block. That's all that separated her from her friend's house. 1 city block. A distance that could be walked in just a few minutes. A distance that seemed negligible, safe, ordinary. She had no bodyguard. She had no weapon. She had no reason to be afraid. She was simply a young woman taking a short walk on an evening in Austin. She had no idea that this walk would be her last journey. A car was waiting. The details of that moment have been preserved through the testimony of a witness who saw what happened. A witness who watched in horror as violence unfolded in real time. The car stopped. It was a 1970 Dodge Polara, a large American sedan with bench seats and a distinctive design. The kind of car that was common on American roads in 1980 but would eventually become a relic of the past. The driver got out. He was a man. Later, he would be identified as Deck Brewer Jr., though at that moment, he was just a predator seizing an opportunity. He approached Susan. According to the witness's account, he grabbed her in what was described as a bear hug. He wrapped his arms around her, immobilizing her, preventing her from screaming or running. He placed a coat over her head. Darkness, disorientation, terror. He forced her into the back of the car. The passenger door opened. There was another person in the car, a passenger whose identity would remain unknown for 44 years, a passenger who was also implicated in the crime, but who remained at large even after Brewer was identified. The witness watched. The witness saw a young woman being abducted on a city street. The witness would later provide crucial information to police, but in that moment, there was nothing the witness could do to stop what was happening. The car drove away. Susan Leigh Wolfe disappeared into the night, taken by a man, or men, with violent intentions, taken from a safe neighborhood in broad view, taken from a short walk that should have been routine and safe. What happened after the abduction, in the hours that followed, can only be partially reconstructed through forensic evidence and police investigation. Susan was driven to a location unknown. She was sexually assaulted. She was subjected to violence and degradation. She was robbed of her dignity, her safety, her autonomy, her life, and then she was murdered. The autopsy would later reveal the cause of death, a gunshot wound to the head. She was also found to have ligature strangulation marks on her body, suggesting that strangulation had also been used against her. She died violently. She died brutally. She died at the hands of someone, or multiple someones, who had chosen violence as a response to an attractive young woman. Early the next morning, January 10th, 1980, Susan's body was discovered. She was found in an alley in Austin at 2000 E 17th Street. The location was not her home. The location was not her friend's house. The location was where her killer, or killers, had abandoned her body. Police responded to the scene. Detectives arrived. Crime scene specialists began their work. Photographs were taken. Evidence was collected. An autopsy was performed. The pathologist examined Susan's body. The examination revealed the horror of what had been done to her. It revealed that she had been sexually assaulted. It revealed evidence of strangulation. It revealed that she had been shot. Most importantly, the autopsy revealed biological evidence that would eventually solve the case, though that evidence would have to wait 44 years for the technology to catch up. The pathologist collected samples. Biological material from the assault was preserved. This material, the evidence of sexual contact, contained the perpetrator's DNA, though at that time in 1980, DNA analysis didn't exist. The technology was decades away, so the samples were stored. They were preserved. They were kept in evidence, waiting for a future that no one could have imagined. The immediate investigation was intense. Police opened a homicide investigation. Detectives were assigned. Resources were dedicated. A witness had seen the abduction. The witness's description of the car was helpful. A 1970 Dodge Polara. This information was broadcast to police departments. Investigators began looking for vehicles matching this description. Over the course of a year, police would follow hundreds of leads. They would track down dozens of cars that fit the witness's description. They would identify over 40 persons of interest. They would interview at least 6 suspects. Some of these suspects were located as far away as New York. The investigation expanded across multiple states. Detectives traveled. Resources were dedicated. The Austin Police Department was committed to solving this case. But each lead went nowhere. Each suspect was cleared. Each interrogation yielded no confession. The investigation was thorough. The investigation was dedicated. But the investigation reached a dead end. As 1980 turned into 1981 and 1981 became 1982, the investigation slowly lost momentum. There were other cases demanding attention. Other victims needed resources. Other crimes moved through the justice system. Susan's case remained officially open, but it became increasingly dormant. The leads had dried up. The suspects had been cleared. New information wasn't emerging. The case was cold. Susan's family grieved. Her parents were devastated by the loss of their daughter. Her friends mourned. The university mourned the loss of a promising nursing student. But as months turned into years, the case received less and less attention. Media coverage faded. The public's attention moved on to other stories. Susan Leigh Wolfe became another unsolved murder case, another file in a growing stack of mysteries without resolution. The Austin Police Department kept the file open. Susan's case was never officially closed. Investigators remained technically available if new leads emerged, but no new leads emerged. The years accumulated. 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, 2010s, 2020s. Technology changed dramatically. The internet was invented. Cell phones became smartphones. DNA science advanced beyond recognition. What had been impossible became routine. But Susan's case remained unchanged, unsolved, a mystery. Her autopsy evidence sat in storage. The biological samples containing her killer's DNA were preserved, but they couldn't be analyzed with the technology of the early years. The DNA itself was fragmented and in small quantities, requiring advanced technology to extract and analyze. As decades passed, investigators developed new techniques. DNA technology became more sensitive. Smaller samples could be analyzed. More complete profiles could be extracted. But Susan's case remained forgotten in the larger stack of unsolved murders. Her family aged. Some family members died without ever seeing justice for Susan. Her parents passed away. Her roommate from that fateful evening passed away. The people who had known her personally were disappearing, but her case remained unsolved. 44 years. That's how long the mystery persisted. In 2023, something changed. The Austin Police Department had established a cold case unit dedicated to revisiting old, unsolved homicides. This unit had the resources and the expertise to use modern technology to investigate cases that had gone cold decades before. The cold case unit looked at many cases, including Susan Leigh Wolfe's murder. In April 2023, detectives from the cold case unit made a decision. They would submit the autopsy evidence from Susan's 1980 murder to the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Laboratory. The evidence had been preserved for 43 years. It had been stored properly. It had been protected. And now, with modern DNA technology available, it was time to extract what information it could provide. The samples were sent to the crime laboratory. Forensic experts examined the evidence. They evaluated whether it was suitable for DNA analysis. Even after 43 years of storage, the biological material was deemed capable of yielding DNA results. They began the process of extraction and analysis. In February 2024, 44 years after Susan Leigh Wolfe was murdered, the Austin Police Department received a DNA profile. The Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Laboratory had successfully extracted and analyzed the biological evidence from Susan's autopsy. The analysis had produced a male DNA profile of the perpetrator. This profile was then entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. CODIS is a national database that contains DNA profiles from convicted offenders, unsolved crime scene evidence, and missing persons. It allows law enforcement to search for matches across multiple jurisdictions. The Austin Police Department entered Susan's perpetrator's DNA profile into CODIS, and they waited for results. In March 2024, they received notification from the Texas Department of Public Safety. There was a match. The DNA profile from Susan's crime scene matched a DNA profile in CODIS. The match pointed to someone incarcerated in Massachusetts. His name was Deck Brewer Jr. Deck Brewer Jr. was 78 years old at the time of the match. He was currently incarcerated at the Massachusetts Department of Corrections on unrelated charges. The investigation suddenly had a direction. Suddenly, after 44 years, there was a name. There was a suspect. There was someone to interview. Once Deck Brewer Jr. was identified as a match, the investigation moved quickly. Detectives in Austin worked with law enforcement in Massachusetts. Information was exchanged. The case was reviewed. A decision was made. Detectives would travel to Massachusetts to interview Brewer. In June 2024, the Travis County District Court issued a DNA search warrant. This warrant authorized law enforcement to obtain a DNA sample from Brewer for direct comparison to the evidence found during Susan's autopsy. In July 2024, Austin police detectives traveled to Massachusetts. They executed the DNA search warrant. They obtained a DNA sample from Brewer. They interviewed him. During the interview, Brewer made statements. He claimed that he had been in San Antonio and Austin, Texas, around the time of Susan's murder in 1980. But when detectives informed him that his DNA had been found at the scene of a homicide, Brewer invoked his right to counsel. "I want a lawyer," he said. The interview ended, but the DNA comparison continued. When the DNA sample from Brewer was compared to the DNA from Susan's autopsy, the results were conclusive. According to the official report from the Texas Department of Public Safety, Deck Brewer Jr. cannot be excluded as the contributor of the partial major component in this DNA profile. The probability of selecting an unrelated person at random, who could be the contributor of the partial major component in this DNA profile, is approximately 1 in 550.5 quintillion. 1 quintillion is followed by 18 zeros. To put this in perspective, the odds of this being someone other than Brewer are so infinitesimally small that they are essentially zero. The science was definitive. Deck Brewer Jr. was the source of the DNA evidence found in Susan Leigh Wolfe during her autopsy. Deck Brewer Jr. had sexually assaulted Susan Leigh Wolfe. Deck Brewer Jr. had likely murdered Susan Leigh Wolfe, or was at least present during her murder. In August 2024, the Austin Municipal Court found probable cause to issue an arrest warrant charging Deck Brewer Jr. with the murder of Susan Leigh Wolfe. The case was solved. 44 years after the crime, Justice finally had a face. The mystery finally had an answer. The arrest of Deck Brewer Jr. solved a major part of the puzzle, but questions remained. The autopsy evidence had revealed that there was evidence of sexual assault by one of two unknown suspects seen in the car, according to the police report. This meant that there was another person in the car with Brewer when Susan was abducted. There was a passenger who was also implicated in the crime. Who was this passenger? The witness had seen two people in the car. The witness had seen Brewer grab Susan and force her into the vehicle, but the witness did not see what the passenger had done. The passenger remained unidentified. The passenger remained at large. The investigation was ongoing. Police released information asking for help in identifying the second suspect. The public was asked to come forward with information about anyone who might have been with Brewer in January 1980. But as of the time of the charges, the second suspect had not been identified. There was also the question of how Brewer had evaded justice for so long. How had he not been identified in the initial investigation? How had he been allowed to live his life without facing consequences for this crime? The answers were frustratingly simple. He had never been a suspect in the case. He had never been interviewed by police. His DNA had never been submitted to law enforcement databases until he was arrested for unrelated charges in Massachusetts decades later. He had essentially disappeared from the view of the Austin police investigation. But in 2024, technology finally caught up with him. When the arrest warrant was issued for Deck Brewer Jr., Susan's family was finally notified of the breakthrough. But the notification brought a complicated mix of emotions. There was relief. There was the feeling that justice was finally being served. There was the knowledge that Susan's case had been solved, that her killer had been identified, that the mystery that had haunted her family for 44 years finally had an answer. But there was also heartbreak. Susan's parents had died without seeing justice for their daughter. They had waded through decades of unanswered questions and cold leads. They had never received the news that their daughter's killer had been identified. Susan's roommate from 1980 had also passed away, as had other people who had known Susan personally. The people who had loved her most were gone. The people who had prayed for justice for her were no longer alive to see it. Justice had come, but it had come too late for those who had loved Susan most. The case that had seemed impossible to solve had finally been solved. The technology that didn't exist in 1980, that didn't exist in 1990, that barely existed in 2000, had finally become sophisticated enough to extract meaning from biological evidence preserved for 4 decades. The autopsy evidence had spoken. The DNA had told its story. The truth, preserved in samples taken at Susan's death, had finally been heard. 44 years is a long time to wait for justice. But justice, even delayed by nearly half a century, is still justice. The questions that remain are important questions. Who was the second suspect? Why was he never identified? Will he also face charges? These questions may eventually be answered, or they may remain forever a mystery. But what we know is that Susan Leigh Wolfe's case is no longer cold. Her killer is no longer free. And the truth of what happened to her on January 9th, 1980, has finally been revealed. If Susan could speak, what would she say? Perhaps she would say, "Thank you for not forgetting me. Thank you for pursuing justice, even when it took decades. Thank you for using every tool available to find the truth." Perhaps she would say, "The wait was long, too long. My parents didn't live to see this day. But justice is justice, even when it comes late." Perhaps she would say, "Remember my name. Remember that I was a person with dreams and hopes and potential. Remember that violence took all of that from me. Remember that justice matters." What do you think about this case? What do you think about waiting 44 years for justice? Do you believe that DNA has changed how we pursue truth? If you have thoughts, please share them in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, if you found this investigation important, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We are dedicated to telling the stories of victims like Susan Leigh Wolfe, the stories of women whose potential was stolen by violence, the stories of families that waited decades for answers, We believe that no victim should be forgotten. No case should be closed without the pursuit of truth. No perpetrator should escape justice indefinitely. This is Yoonjin Lee, and this has been the story of Susan Leigh Wolfe, a nursing student whose killer was finally identified through the power of modern DNA science, 44 years after her murder. Thank you for remembering her name. Thank you for believing that justice matters, no matter how long it takes.